My family always treated me like the backup plan. I accepted it until I inherited everything. Now they want it back, but it's too late. Hey there, welcome to today's story. What are you up to right now? Take a seat, get comfortable, because you're about to hear something that might hit close to home. Today, we're diving into a story where the main character is faced with an unexpected twist in their life. Ever been in a situation where everything you thought you knew suddenly gets turned upside down? You'll want to stick around until the end to see how they overcome it. And hey, if you're enjoying the journey, it would mean a lot if you could help me hit 1,000 subscribers soon so I can keep bringing more awesome stories your way. Thanks a ton. Hey everyone, my name's Kai Anderson and I've been living a life that, on the outside, looked totally normal. I had everything I thought I needed, a loving family, a roof over my head. The usual teenage rebellion, you know? But looking back, I can tell you with certainty that I was never really a part of my family. Not in the way I thought I was supposed to be. Growing up, I always felt like the background character in my own life. My older brother, Evan, he was the golden child. Brilliant, charismatic, always at the top of every list. Our parents, Elliot and Claire, practically worshipped him. He was the future of the family. He was their pride. I, on the other hand, was just there, in the shadows. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, it was always not enough. I'll never forget the day I got a perfect score on a coding project for school. I thought maybe this time they'd see me. But nope. My dad barely even looked up from his holographic tablet and muttered, "Cool, another project. Did Evan get into that space program yet?" That was it. That was my moment. Gone. Like a fart in the wind. Every time I showed my parents something I thought was good, like when I fixed the server at home, saving them a ton of money, they just shrug and say, "Make sure you don't mess anything up next time." Even when I got my driver's license, they told me I wasn't allowed to use the family car just in case you wreck it, they said. But Evan? He crashed the car into a tree 2 weeks later, and Dad laughed it off. Learning experience, he said. It was clear who mattered. As time passed, I realized there was no point trying to get their attention anymore. Why bother? I was just the backup son, the one who didn't matter. Then there was my grandfather, Walter Carter. He wasn't just the old guy who lived down the street from us, or the one who occasionally sent me a birthday card with a couple of bucks in it. No. Grandpa Walter was the one person who saw me for who I was, not as just another cog in the family machine. Not as some afterthought or tool in a game I didn't even realize I was playing. He saw my potential, my struggles, and my dreams, not the disappointment my parents always seemed to see when they looked at me. Grandpa Walter wasn't perfect. In fact, he was far from it. He wasn't the warm, fuzzy kind of guy that other kids might have had. He didn't gush over me, didn't pat my back and say, "I'm so proud of you, kid." But he showed up. That was the difference. He didn't make a big deal out of anything. And yet, his presence was constant in ways my parents couldn't even begin to understand. When I was trying to build my first computer, struggling to figure out why the motherboard wouldn't sync with the new hard drive, Grandpa was the one who quietly walked in. No fanfare. No, you'll get it next time pep talk, just the right tool at the right time. No questions asked. He just handed me the tiny screwdrivers, the parts one needed, and said, "Try these. It'll work out." No other words were necessary. He didn't need to teach me how to fix it. He knew that I could do it on my own, and he just needed to make sure I had the tools to get there. And when my parents forgot to pick me up from school, leaving me stranded in the pouring rain, he was the one who pulled up in his old, beat-up truck. No hesitation, no complaints. Just an understanding nod as he told me to hop in. He didn't ask why they hadn't shown up. He didn't bring up how it had happened again. He simply said, "Come on, kid. Let's get you home." Grandpa wasn't just a man who could fix things with his hands. He was a quiet observer of life, someone who had lived long enough to see the subtle details that most people missed. He saw things clearly, but he didn't share his opinions freely, at least not with anyone who didn't want to hear them. It was like he had a sort of wisdom that came from living a life outside the spotlight. He didn't get caught up in drama or surface-level problems. He knew what mattered, and he had a way of subtly nudging me in the right direction even if I didn't realize it at the time. Every time I'd spend hours with him, working on some random gadget or discussing how technology was changing the world, Grandpa would sprinkle in pieces of advice. He wasn't one for big life lessons, not the kind you'd expect. No long speeches. Just simple statements that always seem to hit hard. You don't need anyone's approval, Kai. If you think you can do it, you can. He didn't say much after that. He didn't need to. His words were simple, but they were meant to stick with me. Then there were the little comments he'd make about the family. He never outright said anything bad about them, but he didn't need to. He could have easily thrown my parents under the bus, told me how they took me for granted, how they didn't value me the way they should have. Instead, he would drop little things here and there. Small, knowing glances when I'd talk about my parents, or the way he'd shake his head when I mentioned how my achievements were always overshadowed by Evan's. His eyes would soften, and he'd just say something like, "Family's a tricky thing, kid. They don't always see you for who you really are, and sometimes that's okay." But he never laid out the full picture. He never gave me the answers I wanted. Instead, he gave me just enough to think for myself. He wasn't one for conflict, not really. I think he understood that his time on this earth wasn't going to last forever, and he didn't want to leave behind a trail of anger or bitterness. He didn't want to stir the pot too much, but he did want to make sure I understood something important. I was more than just the backup plan. I was capable of so much more than I thought. It wasn't until he passed away that I truly realized how deep the secrets in my family ran. Grandpa had always been the quiet observer, the one who saw everything without ever saying too much. But when he was gone, all those little hints he'd given me over the years started to make sense. There was more to the story than I had ever known. I remember after his funeral, I started going through some of his old things, boxes of tools, stacks of old papers, and books he'd collected over the years. At first, it just seemed like random stuff. But as I sifted through his things, something strange caught my eye, a folder wedged deep under his workbench. Inside, there were papers that weren't like the others. They were older, weathered, and looked like they had been handled with care. My hands trembled as I unfolded the documents. It didn't take long for me to realize that Grandpa had kept a lot of secrets, things I never imagined. There were legal documents, contracts, and most shockingly, old letters that revealed a side of my family that had been hidden from me all my life. And as I read through them, I began to understand why Grandpa had always been so careful with me. He knew things I didn't. He knew the family wasn't what it seemed. He had seen the darker side of what my parents were involved in, the things they did behind closed doors, the manipulation, the debts, the power plays. That was when it hit me. Grandpa wasn't just protecting me from my parents' neglect. He was protecting me from something much bigger, something buried deep in the family's history. I wasn't just a neglected child. I was part of a much bigger story that I hadn't even begun to understand. Grandpa had always been there for me, quietly fixing things, offering advice, and showing me the tools I needed to succeed. But now I understood that he had been preparing me for something far more important than I ever realized. He wasn't just my grandfather, he was my guide, my protector, and the only one who saw the truth of my potential. And now, with his passing, I had to figure out what to do with everything he'd left me. The secrets he had kept, the life he had lived, and the lessons he had shared with me all started to come together in a way that was too overwhelming to ignore. Grandpa had set me up for something far greater than I had ever known. A week after Grandpa Walter's funeral, I received a call from his lawyer. At first, I thought it was just a formality. Maybe Grandpa had left me his old tools, a few of his books, or some random trinkets from his past that had no real value but held sentimental meaning. He'd always been a quiet man, not one for grand gestures, so I expected nothing extraordinary. But when I walked into the lawyer's office and saw Evan, Dad, and Mom sitting there, I knew something wasn't right. They were all acting weird, avoiding eye contact, shifting in their seats like they were waiting for something. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. As I stepped into the room, I noticed the stiff atmosphere. The polished mahogany table in the center of the office gleamed under the low, warm light, but it did little to comfort the coldness in the air. Evan was sitting at the far end, hunched over, too focused on his holopad to acknowledge me. I could feel the tension between us, but he didn't care enough to even look up. It was as if he was already planning his next tech acquisition, blissfully detached from whatever was about to happen. Dad was sitting in the chair beside him, arms crossed, his face locked in a grim expression. The usual controlled, composed facade he wore seemed strained, as if he were bracing for something, but what, exactly, I couldn't tell. Mom was the last one to glance up, her eyes flickering with a mix of discomfort and something else. Her gaze didn't meet mine directly. Instead, she looked at the floor before her eyes flicked back up to the lawyer. There was something in her eyes that made me uneasy, something she was hiding, something she wasn't ready to reveal. But I had no idea what it was yet. The silence in the room was suffocating. They were all waiting for the lawyer to speak, but what was he going to say? The lawyer cleared his throat, his eyes briefly scanning the room before locking onto me. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "To my grandson, Kai Anderson," he began, his voice steady but formal, "I leave my entire estate, including but not limited to the family estate at 1536 Oak Street, all investments, vehicles, and personal assets." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything, the entire estate, everything Grandpa had worked for. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was hearing. It didn't make sense. Why me? Why not Evan? He was the one who had always been the golden child. I was the forgotten one, the backup son, the one who barely mattered. The room was suddenly deathly quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside. But inside, it was as if the world had stopped. No one spoke. No one moved. My father was frozen, staring straight ahead, his face pale as though he'd seen a ghost. Evan didn't even look up from his holopad. He was too busy scrolling through something on his screen, probably another tech auction or the latest gadget to add to his collection. It was like I wasn't even there. Like the bombshell that had just been dropped didn't matter to him. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as my mom broke the silence. Her voice was colder than I had ever heard it, tight with disbelief. "This can't be right. There must be a mistake." A mistake? I was still trying to wrap my mind around it, but I wasn't about to let her try to explain this away. There was no mistake. Grandpa Walter had made his intentions clear 6 months ago when he updated his will. I had never expected this. In fact, I never thought about it at all. Grandpa had always been a quiet man, never flaunting his wealth or talking about the family estate. But somehow, in his own way, he'd seen something in me that no one else had, the potential that had always been buried under years of neglect and comparison. The lawyer, a man I had barely met before, nodded gravely. "There is no mistake. Mr. Carter was of sound mind when he made the revisions to his will. He knew exactly what he was doing." I felt the weight of his words settle over me. It was like a fog lifting. Grandpa Walter had made a decision, a final one. And that decision was to leave everything to me. Not Evan, not my parents, me. A rush of emotions hit me all at once. Anger, confusion, relief, and even guilt. I was still processing what this meant, and yet the reality was sinking in. Grandpa had always treated me differently, even when everyone else treated me like an afterthought. But this was something else entirely. My entire life, I had felt like I didn't matter, like I wasn't good enough. And now I was inheriting everything. They had to be furious. I wasn't prepared for this kind of reaction, not in the way they were going to react. Dad was the first to break his silence, his voice thick with tension. "This isn't fair, Kai. You don't know what this means. You can't just take everything like this. You're not even the one who deserves it." His words stung, but they were expected. This wasn't about fairness. This was about power. And in his eyes, I had no right to the things that Grandpa had built. Evan finally looked up from his holopad, his face a mix of disbelief and irritation. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath, but I could hear it loud and clear. His anger was palpable, a cold bitterness lacing his words. I had no doubt in my mind he thought the estate should have been his. He always did. He was the firstborn, the one who had been groomed to take over the family name. But Grandpa Walter didn't see things that way. I tried to keep my composure, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "You never saw me for who I am, did you? All these years I was just a backup plan, the one who didn't matter. And now, I'm the one who's inheriting everything. How does that feel?" The lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the mounting tension. But I didn't care. I didn't care about keeping the peace anymore. For so long, I had been made to feel like I was nothing. And now, I was the one holding the keys to everything they had worked so hard to take from me. I had no idea what to do with it yet, but I was going to make sure that I took control of my future. Not let them manipulate me into giving it all up. Mom opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off before she could say another word. No, this is mine. Grandpa made his choice. I'm not giving it back. Not for any of you. The room was still for a moment as they processed my words. The weight of the situation settled heavily over us. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. They had been so sure of their control over everything, and now it was slipping away. I could see the frustration in their eyes. The dawning realization that their carefully laid plans were falling apart. Dad's expression hardened, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He was already planning his next move, figuring out how to regain the upper hand. But this time I wasn't going to let them. They had spent my entire life making me feel insignificant, as though I was never going to amount to anything. But Grandpa saw something in me, and now I was going to make sure that his legacy, his decision, was honored. Evan slouched back in his chair, glaring at me as if I had just stolen something from him. He was the golden child, the one who was always destined for greatness in their eyes. But now that greatness had slipped through his fingers, and he didn't know how to handle it. I sat there, trying to steady my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what the next steps would be, but one thing was certain. This was a turning point. I was done being the second-rate son. I was done being invisible. The estate was mine, and I would take it on my terms. The lawyer stood up, clearing his throat again, signaling the end of the meeting. If there are no further questions, I'll have the official documents ready for you to sign tomorrow. I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. No more questions, I said, my voice steady. I'll see you tomorrow. Hey, are you finding the story interesting so far? If you are, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue the adventure together. The best part is just ahead. And furious they were. The day after the will reading, my phone started buzzing nonstop with messages. It was like a storm had rolled in, and the text notifications were the thunder that kept reverberating in my head. My parents were in full crisis mode, and even Evan, who was typically too absorbed in his digital world to care about anything remotely personal, was reaching out. Mom's messages were full of fake confusion, each one more desperate than the last. We don't understand, Kai. You're our son. Why are you doing this? She was laying it on thick, trying to pull me back into the web she had spun for years. Each word, each text felt like a fishing line cast into my emotions, trying to reel me in. But I wasn't falling for it anymore. Not this time. Dad called me shortly after. His voice was as stern and cold as ever, a sharp edge to it that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The fair thing would be to split the estate, Kai. Evan is the older son. He's closer to Walter. This is what Walter would have wanted. I could feel the weight of his words in my chest, but I didn't let them sway me. It was the same old routine. The same line of reasoning they had used my whole life, always justifying their actions, always trying to convince me that I was in the wrong. That Evan was the one who deserved everything, just because he was born first. But I knew the truth now. I had spent years being overlooked, cast aside, never good enough for their standards. And now that I had something they wanted, they couldn't stand it. Their desperation was palpable, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me again. I thought about hanging up, blocking their numbers. I had never felt more like an outsider in my own family, but a part of me, an old, reluctant part, still felt guilty. I had spent so many years trying to please them, trying to earn their affection and approval. And yet it had always been Evan who received the praise, Evan who was the focus of all their attention. Now, as they begged me to do the right thing, to share what was mine, I couldn't help but wonder, when had they ever done the right thing for me? The texts kept coming in waves, but I didn't respond. Instead, I did what I always did when I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I retreated to Grandpa Walter's house. Late that night, I found myself sifting through the boxes, the drawers, the stacks of papers Grandpa had left behind. It felt surreal, as though I was looking for answers in a place that had been a refuge for me for so long. His old tools, the mismatched books, the photos of family events that had never quite felt like my family. As I flipped through more of the clutter, something caught my eye. A folder wedged at the back of the drawer in his old desk. It was out of place, hidden behind several other files, like it was waiting for me to find it. I pulled it out slowly, unsure of what I'd uncover. The folder was yellowed with age, the edges frayed and worn. I opened it carefully, as if the contents might shatter if I wasn't gentle enough. The first thing I saw was a letter, handwritten with my name at the top. No date, just my name in bold letters. I didn't know why, but my heart skipped a beat. I unfolded the letter, my hands trembling as I read the first line. Kai, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I have a secret I've kept from your parents, and now it's time for you to know the truth. You are not just my grandson, you are my son. The words blurred in front of my eyes, and for a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. I read it again. And again. Each time, the reality of what I was reading sank in deeper. My son. I wasn't just Grandpa's grandson. I wasn't just some extra in the family photo. My mind raced with the implications. How had I not known? How had they not told me? The room felt colder as the weight of his words pressed down on me. I sat on the floor, surrounded by his belongings. The faint hum of the city outside the only sound. Grandpa Walter, my real father, had kept this secret from everyone, and I could feel the magnitude of it in my bones. I had always wondered why I never seemed to fit in with the rest of the family, why I was always treated differently. But now it made sense. My entire life had been a lie. I felt a rush of emotions. Betrayal, anger, confusion. Why hadn't he told me earlier? It felt like I had been living a lie all along. And now the truth was in front of me, shoved into my face when it was too late. Grandpa had always been the one who looked out for me, the one who saw me when no one else did. But why hadn't he shared this with me? Was it because of the family's expectations? Was it because he knew that if I ever found out, things would never be the same? I read the letter again, trying to piece together what had happened. Grandpa had known everything. He knew how my parents had treated me, how they'd always favored Evan. He knew how they had used me, manipulated me into being the second choice. And yet, he had never told me the truth. Not until now. Why? The more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. Grandpa had been my protector, the one person who saw me for who I truly was. He had watched over me from the shadows, always looking out for me when my parents didn't care. But now in his death, the secret he'd kept had finally come to light. It wasn't just the inheritance. It wasn't just about the money or the house or the assets. It was about the truth. The truth that had been hidden for so long. The truth that I had been lied to, manipulated, and kept in the dark. But now the truth was mine. And it wasn't just about what Grandpa had left me. It was about the life I had lived, the one that had been shaped by lies, and the one I now had to rebuild with the knowledge of who I truly was. I wasn't just Kai Anderson. I wasn't just the forgotten child in the background of a family that never cared. I was Walter Carter's son, the child he had raised in secret. And that meant everything. I stayed there, alone in the house, surrounded by his belongings, his words, and the life he had tried to protect me from. The truth was out. And now it was time to figure out what to do with it. Armed with the truth, I wasn't going to let them get away with this. No, not this time. They thought they could manipulate me into giving up everything Grandpa Walter had left me. The inheritance, the property, the legacy he had crafted with his own hands. They thought they could play on my guilt and make me second-guess myself. But I wasn't the naive child I used to be. I had shed that skin long ago. I wasn't that scared little boy who let them walk all over me anymore. I had learned the hard way that family could be the greatest source of support or the deepest betrayal. For years, I'd been the scapegoat, the forgotten child. But not now. Now, I knew my worth. I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine, and I certainly wasn't going to let them gaslight me into thinking I owed them anything. They owed me. They owed me the respect they'd never given, the love they never showed, and the recognition that I mattered just as much as Evan or any of them for that matter. I started digging into the family's financials. I had to. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about understanding the true nature of the family I had been born into. What I found was staggering. Hidden loans, unpaid debts, a web of financial dishonesty. They had been living a lie for so long, one I had been blind to. They'd spent every dime they had, and then some, trying to project an image of success that didn't exist. They'd lived a life they couldn't afford, throwing money around on appearances, on things they didn't need, just to keep up with the Joneses. I'd always wondered why they seemed so detached, so indifferent to me. Now I understood. It was because they had been too busy chasing empty dreams to pay attention to what truly mattered. And now, with Grandpa gone, they needed me to fix their mistakes. They needed me to bail them out of the mess they had made. They needed the money Grandpa left behind, and they thought I'd be the one to make it right. But I wasn't their solution anymore. I wasn't going to be their backup plan. When they showed up at my doorstep, I was ready. I had braced myself for this moment, for the flood of emotions, the guilt trips, the pleading. But I wasn't backing down. Mom was the first to speak, her voice trembling with that familiar sadness, the kind of sadness she'd used so many times before to manipulate me. "Kai," she said, her eyes wide with faux sincerity, "we're your family. We raised you. Why would you do this to us?" She made it sound like I was betraying them, as though by keeping what Grandpa had left me, I was somehow hurting them. I wanted to laugh in her face. I wanted to scream at her. But instead, I stayed silent. She wasn't going to manipulate me this time. Not anymore. And then came Dad. Using his usual stern tone, trying to sound reasonable like he always did when he wanted me to do something for him. "Kai," he said, his voice firm, "the fair thing would be to split the estate. Evan is the older son. He's closer to Walter. This is what Walter would have wanted." What Walter would have wanted. I repeated the words in my head. They had said it so many times. But Walter was gone. Grandpa was gone. And it wasn't about what he wanted anymore. It was about what I wanted. I had every right to what was left behind. This was not their money, it was mine. It always had been. Evan was standing there, arms crossed, looking at me like I had just committed some unforgivable sin. He was the golden child, always getting what he wanted, always treated like the firstborn. The one who could do no wrong. But this time, the tables had turned. This time, I had the upper hand. He didn't even try to argue with me directly. Instead, he resorted to his usual passive-aggressive act, sending me a message saying I was selfish, calling me out for being unreasonable. But I didn't care anymore. I wasn't going to be his backup plan. Not for anything. Not even for a second. The battle that followed was long, drawn out, and draining. They took me to court, of course. That was inevitable. They tried to contest the will, claiming Grandpa wasn't in his right mind when he wrote it. They said he had been influenced by me, that he was too old to make such a decision, that he had been swayed by my presence in his life. But I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let them take advantage of Grandpa's passing. The truth came out as it always does. And the truth was undeniable. The DNA test proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Grandpa was my real father. The legal battle was over in an instant after that. The court ruled in my favor and their case fell apart. They were speechless. Absolutely speechless. My parents, who had spent their lives manipulating me and everyone around them, were defeated. I watched them leave the courtroom, defeated and broken. They had lost, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of victory, not over them but over myself. I had fought back. I had stood up for myself. I had reclaimed what was mine. And I finally realized something in that moment, standing alone in the courtroom, holding the weight of the truth in my hands. They never really saw me as family. I was just a tool, a means to an end for them. They only saw me as useful when they needed something. But now I had everything they wanted. The house, the investments, the property, the money. I didn't need them. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself to them, trying to gain their approval, their affection. But now I knew I didn't need it. I didn't need their love or their validation. The truth about who I was, about who I had become, was enough. I had Grandpa's legacy, and that was all that mattered. I wasn't just his grandson anymore. I was his son, his blood, and now I would carry his name and his legacy forward. And my family, they could keep their guilt trips and their manipulation. I was done. I wasn't going to be their fallback plan anymore. I wasn't their backup. I was the one who had always mattered. In the end, I kept the estate. But more importantly, I kept my peace. I wasn't the backup plan anymore. I wasn't their second choice. I was the one who mattered. Now I live a quiet life, far away from the chaos they created. No more trying to prove myself. No more playing their games. It's just me, and I'm finally free. So, what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Did the story resonate with you? Or maybe it brought up something you've experienced yourself. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next exciting chapter. Thanks so much for sticking around and listening to the whole story. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to bring you more stories soon.